Think being Emperor of Rome sounds glamorous. Think again. While you're worried about checking your phone for notifications, first-century Roman emperors were checking under their beds for assassins with daggers. These weren't just paranoid thoughts either. The average Roman emperor had about as much job security as a crash test dummy, and they knew it. Picture this. You're the most powerful person in the known world, but you can't sleep at night because literally everyone around you might be planning your murder. Your food could be poisoned, your guards could be bought, and even your own family members might be sharpening their knives. Welcome to Imperial Rome, where the crown came with a built-in death sentence. But some emperors took their paranoia to levels that would make modern conspiracy theorists look reasonable. We're talking about rulers who transformed their living spaces into elaborate shrines to death itself, surrounding themselves with the very symbols that reminded them daily of their own mortality. These weren't just decorations, they were psychological armor against the constant terror of assassination. What drove these men to sleep surrounded by coffins and death imagery? The answer reveals one of history's darkest chapters, where unlimited power created unlimited fear, and where the line between protecting life and preparing for death became impossibly blurred. The transformation from republic to empire didn't just change Rome's government. It fundamentally altered the relationship between power and paranoia in ways that would have made Machiavelli take notes. When Augustus became the first emperor, he didn't just inherit political control, he inherited a target on his back that would never disappear. Here's what most people don't understand about Roman imperial power. Unlike modern dictators who can hide behind layers of security and technology, Roman emperors were expected to be publicly visible. They had to appear at games, hold court, meet with senators, and maintain the illusion that they were just first among equals. This constant exposure made them sitting ducks for anyone with a grudge and a sharp blade. The statistics are terrifying. Of the first dozen emperors, more than half died violent deaths. Julius Caesar was stabbed 23 times by senators in broad daylight. Caligula was hacked to pieces by his own Praetorian Guard. Claudius was probably poisoned by his wife. Nero was driven to suicide by revolts. The pattern was clear. Wearing the purple meant signing your own death warrant. This created a psychological pressure cooker unlike anything in human history. Imagine knowing that your job description literally includes "will probably be murdered" as a primary responsibility. Every meal could be your last. Every meeting could be an ambush. Every friend could be a future assassin waiting for the right moment and the right price. The emperor's response to this constant threat wasn't just increased security, it was a complete reimagining of how to live with death as your closest companion. They didn't try to ignore mortality. They embraced it, studied it, and surrounded themselves with its symbols as a form of psychological preparation. Roman burial customs during the 1st century were already obsessed with death in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. The word sarcophagus literally means flesh-eater in Greek, and these stone coffins were covered with elaborate scenes of death, mythological journeys to the underworld, and protective symbols designed to ward off evil spirits. For ordinary Romans, these burial objects remained safely in tombs until they were needed. But for emperors living under constant death threats, the line between preparation and paranoia became dangerously thin. Why wait until death to benefit from the protective power of these objects? Why not bring them into the palace, where they could serve as both spiritual armor and daily reminders of what awaited every mortal ruler? Archaeological evidence from imperial palaces reveals a fascinating pattern. The deeper archaeologists dig into the private quarters of paranoid emperors, the more death imagery they find. Not just decorative skulls or memento mori, but actual burial objects, protective sarcophagi, and elaborate death masks integrated into the living spaces where these rulers spent their final years. The practice started subtly. A few protective symbols here, some mythological death scenes there. But as the assassination attempts multiplied and the paranoia deepened, some emperors transformed their bedrooms into elaborate shrines that resembled underground burial chambers more than royal sleeping quarters. Take Emperor Tiberius, who spent his final years ruling from a clifftop villa on the island of Capri. What tourists see today as a romantic ruin was actually a fortress tomb designed by a man who had given up on living and focused entirely on surviving. The villa's underground passages, hidden chambers, and maze-like layout weren't just security features, they were the architectural equivalent of a burial complex for someone who was already dead inside. Ancient historians describe Tiberius's final years as those of a living ghost, a man who had withdrawn so completely from life that his residence became indistinguishable from an elaborate mausoleum. The emperor who once commanded legions across the known world ended up ruling from what was essentially a tomb with a view. But Tiberius was just the beginning. His successor, Caligula, took imperial paranoia to levels that redefined insanity itself. After recovering from a mysterious illness that nearly killed him, Caligula became convinced that he was a god, but a god who could still be murdered by mortals. This contradiction created a psychological break that manifested in behaviors so bizarre that historians still debate whether he was insane or just terrifyingly calculating. Caligula's relationship with death became so twisted that he reportedly kept detailed lists of people he planned to execute, updating them daily like a morbid to-do list. His palace became a gallery of death imagery, filled with objects and symbols that reminded everyone, including himself, that life and death were entirely at his discretion. The emperor's bedroom, according to surviving accounts, was transformed into something resembling a shrine to mortality itself. Protective symbols covered every surface. Death masks of previous emperors stared down from the walls. And yes, according to some sources, actual burial objects, including ornate sarcophagi, were positioned around his sleeping area like silent guardians against the assassination attempts that haunted his dreams. This wasn't just decoration. In Roman religious belief, these objects carried real spiritual power. Sarcophagi weren't just containers for dead bodies, they were protective vessels designed to ensure safe passage to the afterlife. The elaborate mythological scenes carved into their surfaces told stories of heroes conquering death, gods protecting mortals, and the triumph of the soul over physical destruction. For an emperor convinced that assassins lurked behind every column and poison waited in every cup, surrounding himself with these protective symbols made perfect psychological sense. If death was inevitable, and for Roman emperors, it absolutely was, then why not arm yourself with every spiritual weapon available? The practice reached its peak during the reign of Emperor Domitian, whose paranoia was so extreme that he lined his palace walls with polished stone so he could see attackers approaching from behind. But the reflective surfaces created an even more disturbing effect. Everywhere Domitian looked, he saw his own reflection multiplied infinitely, creating a hall of mirrors that turned his living space into a visual representation of death's omnipresence. Domitian's bedroom was buried deep within the palace complex, accessible only through a maze of corridors and guarded chambers. Ancient sources describe it as a small, windowless room that felt more like a burial vault than a royal bedroom. The emperor slept with a sword under his pillow and kept his door locked from the inside, but even these precautions couldn't protect him from the fear that had consumed his mind. The room itself was reportedly decorated with images and objects related to death and the afterlife. Protective symbols covered every surface. Burial objects, possibly including actual sarcophagi, were positioned to create a barrier between the sleeping emperor and the spiritual forces that might aid his enemies. It was, in every sense, a bedroom designed by someone who expected to die in it. These weren't the actions of madmen, they were the logical responses of intelligent people trapped in an impossible situation. When your job description includes high probability of violent death, and your employee handbook consists entirely of assassination attempts against your predecessors, surrounding yourself with protective death imagery starts to look like reasonable career planning. The psychological impact of living this way was devastating. Ancient historians describe these later emperors as men who had already died inside, rulers who governed from beyond the grave while their bodies still drew breath. They had become so focused on preparing for death that they had forgotten how to live. But the story gets even stranger when you realize that this wasn't just about individual paranoia. The practice of sleeping surrounded by burial objects and death imagery became a kind of imperial tradition, passed down from one terrified ruler to the next, like a curse that couldn't be broken. Each emperor who adopted these practices justified them slightly differently. Some claimed religious protection, others insisted on practical security benefits. But the underlying truth was always the same. Unlimited power had created unlimited fear. And that fear had transformed the most powerful men in the world into prisoners in their own palaces. The irony is overwhelming. These emperors commanded armies that could conquer nations, controlled wealth that could buy entire kingdoms, and wielded power that could reshape the known world with a single decree. But when night fell, and they retreated to their private chambers, they became terrified children hiding under blankets made of stone coffins and death masks, hoping that tomorrow wouldn't be the day their luck finally ran out. The archaeological evidence tells the rest of the story. In palace after palace, the deeper you dig into the private imperial quarters, the more burial objects you find. Not just decorative elements, but actual functional sarcophagi, elaborate death masks, and protective symbols that belonged in tombs rather than bedrooms. These discoveries reveal emperors who had essentially moved their future burial chambers into their current living spaces, creating a bizarre fusion of palace and mausoleum that reflected minds completely consumed by the certainty of their own violent deaths. The transformation of imperial living spaces into death shrines wasn't just about furniture placement. It represented a complete psychological breakdown of the boundary between life and death that would have horrified ordinary Romans. While regular citizens kept their burial preparations strictly separate from daily life, these emperors were essentially living inside their own tombs years before they died. The ritual aspects of this behavior reveal just how far imperial paranoia had progressed beyond rational security measures. Roman religious tradition held that certain burial objects possessed protective powers that could ward off evil spirits and malevolent forces. For emperors who believed their enemies might use supernatural means alongside conventional assassination attempts, surrounding themselves with these protective artifacts wasn't just psychological comfort, it was spiritual warfare. Ancient sources describe elaborate nightly rituals performed by some emperors before retiring to their death-surrounded bedrooms. They would inspect each burial object, touch specific protective symbols in predetermined sequences, and recite prayers normally reserved for the dead. These weren't the actions of rational rulers preparing for sleep, they were the desperate ceremonies of men who had convinced themselves that only by embracing death completely could they hope to postpone it temporarily. The servants and guards who witnessed these nightly preparations left behind accounts that read like horror stories. Imagine being a palace attendant whose job was to arrange sarcophagi around your emperor's bed each night, positioning death masks at precise angles to provide maximum spiritual protection. These workers weren't just maintaining a bedroom, they were staging a daily funeral for someone who was still alive. The psychological toll on everyone involved was enormous. Palace staff developed their own superstitions about working in these death-obsessed environments. Some refused to enter the emperor's private chambers after dark. Others reported nightmares about the burial objects coming to life. The entire imperial household became infected with the same death fixation that consumed their rulers. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this imperial death cult was how it affected the emperor's decision-making. When you spend your nights surrounded by reminders of mortality, your daytime choices start reflecting that obsession. These rulers began making political and military decisions based not on rational analysis, but on death omens, burial superstitions, and the imagined protective power of their accumulated funeral objects. Emperor Nero provides a perfect example of how this death obsession could spiral completely out of control. After surviving several assassination attempts, Nero became convinced that his enemies were using supernatural forces against him. His response was to transform sections of his palace into what can only be described as a museum of death, filled with burial objects from across the empire. Nero's collection included sarcophagi from Egypt, death masks from Greece, and protective symbols from every corner of the Roman world. He believed that by surrounding himself with burial objects from different cultures, he could tap into multiple forms of spiritual protection simultaneously. His bedroom became an international exhibition of funeral art, curated by a man who was slowly losing his grip on reality. The emperor's daily routine revolved entirely around these objects. He would spend hours studying the mythological scenes carved into sarcophagus surfaces, looking for hidden messages about how to avoid the fate of the heroes depicted. He commissioned scholars to research the protective properties of different burial symbols and hired priests to bless his collection regularly. Nero had essentially turned death preparation into a full-time job. Ancient historians describe the emperor's final months as a period when he rarely left his death-surrounded chambers during daylight hours. He had become so convinced that his burial objects provided essential protection that he felt vulnerable whenever separated from them. The most powerful man in the world had become a prisoner of his own funeral collection. The financial cost of maintaining these death obsessions was staggering. Imperial records show enormous expenditures on acquiring rare burial objects, hiring specialists to authenticate their protective properties, and maintaining the elaborate chambers where they were housed. Some emperors spent more on their living funeral arrangements than entire provinces spent on infrastructure and defense. The irony was that all this death preparation actually made the emperors more vulnerable, not less. Their obsessive focus on burial objects and protective rituals distracted them from real security threats. While they were arranging sarcophagi and consulting death omens, actual conspirators were planning very practical assassination attempts, using conventional weapons and inside information. The palace staff who worked in these environments developed their own coping mechanisms for dealing with the daily horror of their duties. Some created secret rituals to protect themselves from the spiritual contamination they believed came from handling so many burial objects. Others formed underground networks to share information about which protective symbols seemed most effective at keeping their increasingly unstable employers calm. These workers' accounts provide some of the most chilling details about life inside the imperial death chambers. They describe emperors who would wake screaming from nightmares, then spend hours rearranging their protective objects based on dream interpretations. They tell of rulers who refused to eat meals that hadn't been blessed by touching specific sarcophagi first. They report conversations where emperors spoke more frequently with their death masks than with living advisors. The medical consequences of living this way were severe. Ancient physicians noted that emperors who adopted these death-obsessed lifestyles developed chronic insomnia, digestive problems, and what we might now recognize as severe anxiety disorders. The constant stress of living surrounded by reminders of mortality took a devastating toll on both mental and physical health. Some imperial doctors tried to intervene, suggesting that removing the burial objects might improve their patient's condition, but these emperors had become so convinced that their protective symbols were the only things keeping them alive that any suggestion of change was interpreted as an assassination attempt in disguise. Several court physicians were executed for proposing that their emperor might sleep better without a sarcophagus next to the bed. The architectural modifications required to accommodate these death obsessions were extensive and expensive. Palace engineers had to reinforce floors to support the weight of multiple stone sarcophagi, install special ventilation systems to prevent the musty smell of burial objects from overwhelming living spaces, and create hidden passages so servants could maintain the funeral collections without disturbing the emperor's increasingly erratic sleep patterns. These construction projects created their own security problems. The constant renovation work meant strangers were regularly present in the most sensitive areas of the palace. The hidden passages designed to serve the death chambers could just as easily be used by assassins. The structural modifications weakened walls and created new vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit, but the emperors were so focused on supernatural threats that they ignored these practical security concerns. They had become convinced that physical assassination attempts were less dangerous than spiritual attacks, so they prioritized mystical protection over conventional security measures. This backwards thinking made them sitting ducks for the very real, very physical conspiracies that were constantly forming around them. The religious establishment found itself in an impossible position regarding these imperial death cults. On one hand, Roman tradition did recognize the protective power of burial objects and funeral rituals. On the other hand, the extreme lengths to which some emperors took these practices violated basic religious principles about the separation between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Some priests tried to provide guidance about appropriate use of burial imagery in living spaces, but their advice was usually ignored or misinterpreted by emperors who were beyond rational counsel. Others simply went along with whatever their imperial patrons demanded, blessing sarcophagi for bedroom use and performing funeral rites for people who were still alive. The entire religious system became corrupted by the need to accommodate rulers who had lost all perspective on mortality. The psychological impact on the broader imperial family was devastating. Wives, children, and relatives of these death-obsessed emperors were forced to live in environments that resembled mausoleums more than palaces. Family dinners were held in rooms decorated with burial scenes. Children played in hallways lined with protective death masks. Normal family life became impossible when the head of household had transformed the family residence into an elaborate tomb. Some imperial family members tried to maintain separate living quarters away from the death-obsessed areas, but this created suspicion and paranoia. Emperors who had surrounded themselves with burial objects for protection began to view family members who avoided these spaces as potential threats, who might be immune to the spiritual protection that kept everyone else loyal. The diplomatic consequences were equally serious. Foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries found themselves conducting official business in rooms that looked like funeral parlors. Some refused to enter the death-surrounded chambers at all, creating international incidents over what were essentially interior decorating choices. The reputation of Roman imperial power suffered when other nations realized their emperors were literally living in tombs. Trade relationships became strained as word spread about the bizarre burial object collections that filled imperial palaces. Some foreign merchants refused to sell valuable goods to rulers who might use them as funeral props rather than proper trade items. Others raised prices dramatically, treating sales to death-obsessed emperors as specialty funeral services rather than normal commercial transactions. The military implications were perhaps most serious of all. Roman legions depended on their emperors to project strength and rational leadership. But commanders who spent their time rearranging sarcophagi and consulting death omens inspired little confidence among professional soldiers who needed practical military guidance, not mystical funeral rituals. Several military revolts during the 1st century were directly triggered by reports of emperors' bizarre burial obsessions reaching the frontier armies. Soldiers who had signed up to follow strong leaders into battle found themselves serving rulers who spent more time talking to death masks than planning military campaigns. The psychological disconnect between imperial image and imperial reality created a crisis of confidence that weakened Rome's military effectiveness across multiple theaters of operation. The economic impact of these death-obsessed lifestyles rippled throughout the entire empire. Skilled craftsmen were pulled away from productive work to create elaborate burial objects for living emperors. Stonemasons who should have been building infrastructure were instead carving protective sarcophagi for palace bedrooms. Metalworkers abandoned practical projects to forge ornate death masks that would never be used for their intended purpose. The demand for rare burial materials drove up prices across the Mediterranean world. Egyptian granite became scarce because emperors wanted authentic pharaoh-style sarcophagi for their bedrooms. Greek marble quarries couldn't keep up with orders for death masks that required specific types of stone believed to have protective properties. The entire luxury goods market became distorted by rulers who treated funeral supplies like essential daily necessities. Local governors found themselves caught between impossible demands from death-obsessed emperors and the practical needs of their provinces. Imperial orders would arrive requesting immediate shipment of burial objects that took months to create, while urgent infrastructure projects went unfunded because all available resources were being diverted to satisfy the latest imperial funeral fantasy. The administrative burden of maintaining these collections was enormous. Palace bureaucrats had to develop entirely new record-keeping systems to track hundreds of burial objects, their supposed protective properties, optimal placement schedules, and maintenance requirements. Government clerks who should have been managing tax collection or military logistics instead found themselves cataloguing sarcophagi like inventory in a very expensive, very morbid warehouse. The legal system became infected with the same death obsession that consumed the emperors. New laws were created to govern the acquisition, transport, and use of burial objects in living spaces. Court cases arose over whether certain protective symbols belonged to the living emperor or should be reserved for actual funerals. The entire judicial framework had to adapt to rulers who insisted on treating funeral preparations as matters of national security. Some of these legal battles were genuinely surreal. Imperial courts heard testimony about the comparative protective value of different sarcophagus designs. Witnesses were called to verify the authenticity of death masks. Legal experts debated whether burial objects lost their spiritual power if used by living people. The Roman legal system, renowned for its practical logic, was forced to address questions that belonged more in horror stories than courtrooms. The documentation requirements alone were staggering. Every burial object had to be authenticated, catalogued, blessed, positioned according to specific protocols, and regularly maintained by qualified specialists. The paperwork generated by imperial death obsessions filled entire government archives. Future historians would find more detailed records about sarcophagus placement than about some major military campaigns. The training programs for palace staff became increasingly specialized and bizarre. New employees had to learn proper handling techniques for burial objects, memorize the supposed protective properties of different death symbols, and master the complex rituals required to maintain imperial funeral collections. Job descriptions that once focused on conventional palace duties now read like instruction manuals for mortuary assistants. The psychological screening process for palace workers became equally important. Potential employees had to demonstrate they could handle daily exposure to death imagery without developing their own mental health problems. Many otherwise qualified candidates were rejected simply because they couldn't maintain their sanity while working in environments that resembled elaborate mausoleums. The turnover rate among palace staff skyrocketed as workers found themselves unable to cope with the daily horror of serving death-obsessed rulers. Those who stayed often developed their own protective rituals and superstitions, creating a palace culture where everyone was constantly performing small ceremonies to ward off the spiritual contamination they believed came from handling so many burial objects. The international intelligence community took careful note of these developments. Foreign spies realized that Roman emperors who spent their time obsessing over funeral arrangements were distracted from actual governance and military planning. Enemy nations began timing their aggressive moves to coincide with periods when Roman rulers were particularly absorbed in rearranging their death collections. Some foreign powers even attempted to exploit these obsessions directly. Egyptian merchants sold fake protective artifacts to paranoid emperors, knowing they would pay enormous sums for burial objects they believed would keep them safe. Greek con artists created elaborate death masks with fictitious protective properties, then charged premium prices to rulers who had lost all ability to distinguish between genuine spiritual protection and expensive nonsense. The corruption opportunities were endless. Palace officials discovered they could manipulate imperial policy by claiming that certain decisions were supported or opposed by omens found in the burial objects. Military commanders learned to present strategic recommendations as interpretations of mythological scenes carved into sarcophagus surfaces. The entire government became a theater where rational policymaking was disguised as supernatural consultation with funeral props. The scientific understanding of the time made these delusions even more dangerous. Roman medicine had no concept of mental illness as we understand it today. Physicians treating increasingly unstable emperors focused on physical symptoms while completely missing the psychological breakdown that was driving the death obsessions. Medical treatments often made things worse by validating the emperor's belief that spiritual forces were attacking their health. The religious festivals and ceremonies that punctuated Roman life became contaminated by imperial death fixations. Traditional celebrations that should have focused on life, prosperity, and civic virtue instead became opportunities for emperors to display their latest burial acquisitions. Public religious observances turned into morbid exhibitions where rulers showed off death masks and protective symbols instead of engaging in normal ceremonial activities. The artistic community found itself trapped between patronage opportunities and moral revulsion. Talented sculptors and painters could earn enormous fees creating burial objects for living emperors, but the work required them to produce art that violated basic aesthetic principles about the separation between life and death. Many artists developed drinking problems or abandoned their careers entirely rather than continue contributing to the imperial death cult. The educational system suffered as imperial priorities shifted toward death-related studies. Schools that once taught rhetoric, mathematics, and practical skills were pressured to add courses on burial symbolism, protective artifact identification, and funeral ritual interpretation. Young Romans who should have been learning useful trades instead found themselves studying subjects that prepared them only for careers serving mentally unstable rulers obsessed with their own mortality. The technological innovation that had driven Roman engineering achievements ground to a halt as resources were diverted toward funeral-related projects. Engineers who might have designed better aqueducts or roads instead found themselves calculating optimal sarcophagus placement for maximum spiritual protection. The empire's infrastructure development stagnated, while its rulers focused on perfecting their bedroom burial arrangements. The social fabric of Roman society began showing serious strain as news of imperial death obsessions spread throughout the population. Citizens who had once taken pride in Roman power and efficiency now felt embarrassed by rulers who seemed more interested in preparing for death than in actually governing. The psychological contract between emperor and people was breaking down as it became clear that the imperial system was producing leaders who were fundamentally unfit for the responsibilities of power. The moral authority that had sustained Roman rule for centuries eroded as people realized their emperors were spending public resources on private funeral fantasies while neglecting basic governmental duties. Tax money that should have funded public works or military defense was instead paying for elaborate burial collections that served no purpose beyond feeding imperial paranoia. The long-term consequences of this imperial death cult extended far beyond the individual rulers who practiced it. The entire Roman political system was being warped by the need to accommodate leaders whose relationship with reality had been completely severed by unlimited power and constant fear. Future emperors would inherit not just political authority, but also the expectation that they too might retreat into death-obsessed isolation when the pressures of rule became overwhelming. The precedent had been set. Once it became acceptable for emperors to transform their living spaces into elaborate tombs, the boundary between rational leadership and psychological breakdown became permanently blurred. The Roman Empire had created a political system that systematically drove its leaders insane, then provided them with the resources and authority to act on their insanity in ways that affected millions of people. The archaeological evidence continues to reveal new details about just how extensive these practices became. Recent excavations have uncovered palace complexes where entire wings were converted into storage areas for imperial burial collections. The scale of these operations was industrial, requiring dedicated staff, specialized facilities, and enormous ongoing expenditures to maintain collections that served no practical purpose, beyond feeding the psychological needs of rulers who had lost touch with reality. The documentation left behind by palace administrators provides a window into daily life in these death-obsessed environments that reads like something from a horror novel. Work schedules that included time for blessing sarcophagi, maintenance logs for protective death masks, and personnel evaluations that rated employees on their ability to work effectively while surrounded by constant reminders of mortality. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how quickly these practices normalized within the imperial system. What began as the desperate measures of individual paranoid rulers gradually became accepted protocol for imperial security. Palace designers started including death chambers as standard features. Government officials developed expertise in funeral object procurement and maintenance. The entire Roman imperial apparatus adapted to serve rulers whose primary concern was not governing an empire, but preparing for their own violent deaths. The transformation was complete. The Roman Empire, which had conquered most of the known world through military discipline and administrative efficiency, had evolved into a system designed primarily to enable its leaders' elaborate suicide preparations. The most powerful political entity in human history had become, in essence, a very expensive and very dangerous funeral home for living emperors who had already died inside. The strangest part of this imperial death cult wasn't just how it consumed individual emperors, it was how it became a recruitment tool for the conspiracies that would eventually destroy them. Palace servants who spent their days arranging burial objects around their emperor's bed weren't just witnesses to imperial madness. They were participants in it, and many of them eventually decided they'd had enough. Consider the psychological profile of someone whose job description includes daily sarcophagus maintenance for living emperor. These weren't random palace workers. They were trusted insiders with intimate access to the most paranoid rulers in history. They knew exactly when their emperor was most vulnerable because they helped create the elaborate death rituals that governed his daily schedule. The irony was overwhelming. Emperors who surrounded themselves with protective burial objects were essentially training their own assassins. Every servant who learned the precise timing of the emperor's nightly death preparations also learned the perfect moment to strike. Every guard who helped position protective sarcophagi around the imperial bedchamber also mapped out the exact layout they'd need to navigate during an assassination attempt. The conspirators didn't need to overcome sophisticated security systems, they just needed to understand funeral scheduling. When your emperor spends 2 hours every night arranging death masks according to astrological calculations, you know exactly where he'll be and exactly when he'll be distracted. The burial objects that were supposed to provide protection instead created predictable routines that made targeting these rulers remarkably simple. Palace records reveal assassination plots that read like instruction manuals for exploiting imperial death obsessions. Conspirators would study their target's burial collection to identify which objects required the most handling, then plan their attacks during the maintenance periods when the emperor would be focused on spiritual protection rather than physical security. Some plots were almost embarrassingly straightforward. One group of conspirators realized their emperor always personally inspected each sarcophagus in his bedroom before sleeping. Following the same route every night, they simply positioned themselves along that route and waited. Another conspiracy succeeded because the plotters knew their target spent every dawn rearranging protective symbols based on overnight dreams, leaving him isolated and distracted in a chamber filled with heavy stone objects that could muffle screams. The assassination of Emperor Domitian provides the perfect example of how these death obsessions became self-fulfilling prophecies. His elaborate security measures the reflective walls, the hidden bedroom, the maze-like palace layout were all designed to prevent exactly what happened. But his paranoid routines created opportunities that more conventional security arrangements might have eliminated. Domitian's killers didn't need to overcome his sophisticated defenses, they just needed to understand his psychological weaknesses. The emperor, who slept surrounded by protective burial objects, had trained his assassins by demonstrating exactly how his death preparations worked. When the attack finally came, it succeeded not despite his elaborate precautions, but because of them. The conspirators knew that Domitian would be alone in his burial-surrounded chamber during specific hours. They knew he would be distracted by his nightly protective rituals. They knew the exact layout of the room because they had helped maintain the funeral objects positioned there. Most importantly, they knew that the emperor's psychological state had deteriorated to the point where he might not even resist effectively when confronted with the death he had been preparing for so obsessively. The actual assassination was almost anticlimactic. After years of elaborate death preparations, Domitian was killed by people who had watched him practice dying every single night. The protective symbols that covered his walls didn't save him. The burial objects that filled his chamber didn't protect him. The spiritual armor he had assembled over years of paranoid collecting proved completely useless against attackers who understood his routines better than he did. But the story doesn't end with individual assassinations. The real tragedy of the imperial death cult was how it infected the entire Roman political system with a kind of institutional insanity that would persist for generations. Future emperors inherited not just political power, but also the expectation that they too would eventually retreat into death-obsessed isolation when the pressures became overwhelming. The precedent had been set, and it created a vicious cycle that Roman politics never fully escaped. Each new emperor faced the same impossible choice: maintain the illusion of normal leadership while constantly expecting assassination, or acknowledge the reality of imperial mortality by surrounding yourself with the symbols and tools of death. Most chose the second option, which meant the Roman Empire was consistently governed by rulers who had essentially given up on living. The administrative machinery of the empire adapted to this reality in ways that would have been unthinkable during the Republic. Government departments developed expertise in funeral object procurement. Palace architects included death chambers in their standard designs. Military commanders learned to present strategic recommendations as interpretations of burial symbolism rather than tactical analysis. The entire imperial system became an elaborate theater where rational governance was disguised as consultation with protective funeral objects. Policy decisions that should have been based on military intelligence, economic data, or diplomatic negotiations were instead justified through reference to omens supposedly revealed by sarcophagus arrangements or death mask positioning. This wasn't just inefficient government, it was actively dangerous government. When your empire spans 3 continents and your enemies are constantly probing for weaknesses, having leaders who spend more time talking to burial objects than analyzing actual threats creates vulnerabilities that hostile nations are quick to exploit. Foreign intelligence services learned to time their operations around Roman imperial funeral rituals. Enemy commanders discovered they could predict Roman military movements by understanding which protective symbols their emperor was currently consulting. The death obsessions that were supposed to protect imperial power instead broadcast Roman weaknesses to anyone paying attention. The economic consequences rippled throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Trade relationships suffered when foreign merchants realized they were dealing with rulers who might use valuable goods as funeral props rather than normal commercial items. Diplomatic negotiations became surreal exercises where international agreements were evaluated based on their compatibility with burial symbolism rather than practical political considerations. The military implications were even more serious. Roman legions had conquered most of the known world through discipline, training, and rational strategy, but soldiers serving under death-obsessed emperors found themselves receiving orders that made sense only in the context of funeral preparations rather than actual military objectives. Battle plans were modified to accommodate imperial burial superstitions. Troop movements were timed according to protective ritual schedules rather than tactical advantages. Supply lines were diverted to transport burial objects for imperial collections rather than weapons and food for fighting armies. The professional military machine that had built the empire was being gradually corrupted by leaders who cared more about their own death preparations than about maintaining Roman power. The social contract between ruler and ruled began breaking down as ordinary citizens realized their emperors were more interested in arranging sarcophagi than governing an empire. Tax money that should have funded infrastructure, defense, or public services was instead paying for elaborate funeral collections that served no purpose beyond feeding imperial paranoia. The psychological impact on Roman society was profound. Citizens who had once taken pride in Roman strength and efficiency now felt embarrassed by rulers who seemed more qualified to run funeral parlors than govern a world empire. The confidence that had sustained Roman expansion for centuries eroded as people realized their political system was systematically producing leaders who were fundamentally unfit for the responsibilities of power. The religious establishment found itself compromised by the need to validate imperial death obsessions that violated basic spiritual principles. Priests who should have been providing moral guidance instead found themselves blessing sarcophagi for bedroom use and performing funeral rites for people who were still alive. The entire religious framework that supported Roman society became corrupted by rulers who demanded supernatural justification for their psychological breakdowns. The educational system suffered as imperial priorities shifted toward death-related studies that prepared young Romans for careers serving mentally unstable rulers rather than contributing to productive society. Schools that once taught practical skills now included courses on burial symbolism and protective artifact identification. The intellectual foundation that had produced Roman engineering, law, and administrative innovations was being replaced by curriculum designed to service imperial funeral fantasies. The artistic community faced impossible choices between lucrative patronage and moral integrity. Talented creators could earn enormous fees producing burial objects for living emperors, but the work required them to contribute to a system that was obviously destroying Roman civilization from within. Many artists abandoned their careers rather than continue enabling imperial death cults that were warping society beyond recognition. The long-term consequences extended far beyond the individual rulers who practiced these obsessions. The Roman political system had created a feedback loop where unlimited power inevitably produced unlimited paranoia, which then manifested as elaborate death preparations that consumed resources and attention needed for actual governance. Each generation of emperors inherited not just political authority but also the psychological burden of knowing that their predecessors had been driven insane by the same pressures they now faced. The solution surrounding themselves with burial objects and protective symbols provided temporary psychological comfort while ensuring that the cycle would continue with the next ruler. The archaeological evidence continues revealing new details about how extensive these practices became across multiple imperial dynasties. Palace excavations uncover burial collections that rivaled major museums in scope and variety. Storage facilities designed specifically for maintaining imperial funeral objects, administrative records documenting the care and feeding of death obsessions that consumed enormous resources while contributing nothing to Roman strength or stability. The documentation left behind reads like a case study in institutional madness. Work schedules that prioritized sarcophagus maintenance over military briefings, budget allocations that spent more on death masks than on frontier defense, personnel evaluations that rated employees on their ability to work effectively while surrounded by constant reminders of mortality. But perhaps most disturbing was how these practices spread beyond the imperial household into the broader Roman elite. Senators began adopting scaled-down versions of imperial death obsessions. Provincial governors started surrounding themselves with protective burial objects. Military commanders commissioned personal sarcophagi for use during campaigns. The madness that began with individual emperors metastasized throughout the entire Roman power structure. The empire that had once conquered the world through rational planning and disciplined execution was transforming into a civilization obsessed with death preparation at the expense of life management. The political system that had created unprecedented prosperity and stability was evolving into an elaborate suicide cult for people who already controlled more power than any humans in history. The final irony was that all this death preparation made the emperors more likely to die violently, not less. The elaborate security measures designed to prevent assassination instead created opportunities for conspirators who understood imperial routines. The spiritual protection that was supposed to ward off enemies instead broadcast weaknesses to anyone paying attention. The psychological armor constructed from burial objects and death symbols proved completely useless against the very real, very practical threats that eventually killed every single emperor who practiced these obsessions. The Roman Empire had created the ultimate paradox, a political system so successful that it gave its leaders enough power to destroy themselves and enough resources to do it in the most elaborate and expensive way possible. The civilization that conquered the world through strength and rationality was being consumed from within by rulers who had forgotten how to live because they were so focused on preparing to die. The legacy of these imperial death cults extended far beyond ancient Rome. They established a template for how unlimited power corrupts not just through traditional abuse, but through psychological breakdown that manifests as elaborate self-destructive behaviors disguised as protective measures. The pattern would repeat throughout history whenever political systems concentrated too much authority in individuals who lacked the psychological tools to handle the pressure. The emperors who slept, surrounded by coffins, weren't just historical curiosities. They were warning signs of what happens when human beings are given more power than human psychology can safely process. Their elaborate death preparations weren't solutions to the problems of imperial rule, they were symptoms of a political system that had evolved beyond the capacity of its leaders to manage rationally. The stone sarcophagi that filled their bedrooms, the death masks that stared down from their walls, and the protective symbols that covered every surface weren't keeping them safe. They were marking time until the inevitable moment when paranoia, conspiracy, and the fundamental impossibility of their position would finally converge in the violent deaths they had been preparing for all along. The most powerful men in the world had become prisoners of their own mortality, trapped in palaces that resembled mausoleums, governing an empire while essentially already dead inside. They had surrounded themselves with every symbol of death except the one that mattered most, the recognition that no amount of preparation could protect them from the consequences of a political system that systematically drove its leaders insane. The emperors who slept surrounded by coffins weren't just paranoid madmen making bizarre decorating choices. They were the inevitable product of a political system that gave human beings more power than human psychology could safely handle. When you create a job where success means everyone wants to kill you, don't be surprised when the job holders start acting like they're already dead. These rulers surrounded themselves with sarcophagi and death masks because they understood something we often forget. Unlimited power doesn't make you immortal, it just makes your mortality more expensive and more elaborate. They chose to live inside their own tombs because the alternative was pretending that being emperor was somehow survivable, when every single one of their predecessors proved otherwise. The real tragedy wasn't that these emperors died violent deaths. The real tragedy was that the Roman Empire created a system so successful it could afford to let its leaders go completely insane without immediate collapse. A civilization that conquered the world through rational discipline ended up being ruled by men who spent more time arranging burial objects than governing an empire. Maybe the next time someone complains about modern politicians being out of touch, we should remember that at least they're not literally sleeping in coffins while making policy decisions. Though, honestly, given some recent political developments, we might want to check their bedroom furniture just to be safe. The stone coffins are long gone, but the lesson remains. Give someone enough power to reshape the world, and they might just use it to build the most elaborate tomb in history with themselves still inside it.